Have you ever wanted to revisit the story of a JRPG and then you realize you really don't want to drop dozens of hours into the battles of that game again? Well, that feeling might explain why over the years we've seen a lot of JRPGs get their stories adapted into manga form. Probably the biggest example of this would be Pokemon Adventures, but even though that manga is amazing, it pretty much tells its own story and goes way past the scope of the original game's story. And for this video, I'll be looking more at manga that try to be more of a straight up adaptation of the games. So after Pokemon, most people are probably thinking that the most popular JRPG that you would do an adaptation of this kind for would be one of the Final Fantasy games. Surprisingly though, there's mostly only spin-off kinds of stories, and Final Fantasy games only got a more straightforward adaptation with Final Fantasy 3 and 12. The one for FF3 looks pretty good, but I can't find it in English, so yeah. And then I checked out the one for FF12, but there's something that's put me off reading it. Look at that artwork.
You serious?
I mean, it's not the worst art ever, it's just pretty awkward looking, but then when you compare it to the original game or even the concept art, it looks like total garbanzo in comparison. And then there's also really inappropriate fan service and a strange tone to the writing that didn't nearly live up to the quality of the game. So these underwhelming experiences with Final Fantasy kinda got me thinking, why isn't Square Enix putting an effort into mangatizing some of their most popular games? Even classics like Chrono Trigger only ever got a one-shot manga, which in all honesty, the one-shot is pretty good and has this cool moment that acknowledges the branching paths of the game, but yeah. There was also a spin-off gag manga starring minor characters from Chrono Trigger, but come on, the designs for the game were done by the creator of Dragon Ball, Akira Toriyama, and you're not gonna turn this into a fully fledged manga? Well, maybe this is the case because they were too busy focusing on adapting all these Dragon Quest games, which are also styled around Akira Toriyama's art style, so of course they're all perfect candidates to be turned into manga as well. The most well-known one, Dragon Quest: The Adventure of Dai, ran for over 300 chapters and has some stellar art, action, and shonen storytelling. With this first one being so good, it's no wonder why they made so many more of these adaptations and that they've been so popular with fans. Different Dragon Quest manga were so popular that they even made a manga about the creation of the first Dragon Quest game. This one is actually really fun for just how unique of a story this is for a manga, especially since the game was the first big hit for a lot of people involved. So seeing them at the bottom of the mountain, knowing the peaks they would reach later in life is a fun journey to follow. And speaking of Dragon Quest, it's one of the big inspirations for the Mother series, which is most obvious in the similar stylings of their battle systems. Other than that though, the Mother series couldn't be more unique, so I was really pleasantly surprised when I found out that Mother 2, also known as Earthbound, got a manga adaptation of its own. I really just couldn't wait to see how they would translate all the weird and wacky stuff that makes up Mother 2's plot into manga form. And then I was really surprised to see that the art style, for some reason, went really Disney on this one. I mean, even the author's name is stylized like the Disney logo. It's funny because all the concept art and promotional materials look so different from how the main characters are depicted here. It makes me wonder that maybe the artist was only given the pixel art to go off or something. I mean, I really started to think this because all the enemies, which were given bigger and more detailed sprites in the game, were depicted with much more surprising amounts of accuracy in the manga than the main characters were. The plot is also surprisingly accurate too. Mother 2's plot is so nonsensical at times with the thinnest threads tying it together, but somehow this manga manages to hit most of the beats of the story without cutting out all that much. It ends up being really fun to see all these weird places and characters condensed down to be told in a really short time, and it gives the manga this frantic pacing that makes it a really weird and entertaining read. Now this manga isn't the best when standing alone. I think this is one that you really need to have played the game to enjoy to the fullest, because a lot of the enjoyment was seeing the weird translation that took place when changing mediums, and it ended up being so interesting just because of that. Seeing all the characters you loved from Mother 2 depicted in ways you wouldn't expect makes this a really fun way to experience that story again. So yeah, it was really cool to see the weird storytelling of Mother 2 condensed into a manga, but what about those RPG stories that seem so tied to the game mechanics that it seems like it would be almost impossible to turn those stories into a manga? A perfect example of that is Legend of Mana, where one of the main mechanics of the game is choosing how you lay out the world, and so you end up experiencing the story in a very player-driven way. So yeah, the manga has to somehow translate this disjointed, player-driven storytelling style of the game into a more straightforward medium, and honestly, somehow I think it does a pretty good job. The game has you choosing what quests you want to do and when. The problem is that there's so many that a lot of them just feel like random side tangents, and it kind of makes it hard to know which of those are good for a manga adaptation. But surprisingly, the manga doesn't drop all this and just focus on the main story. No, it really embraces those side content feeling quest lines, and it really works in this framing of being a lighthearted and funny episodic adventure story. An important part of what makes it all work is how well they translated the awesome art style of the original game. Legend of Mana has such incredible pixel art that it's a really tall order to replicate it, especially using only black and white. But the author really gave life to their interpretation of the world and characters. And because you have all these disjointed and episodic little stories taking place, it really helps that there's tons of jokes added in the manga and that the characters are super expressive and wacky. So what could have been a confusing mess turns out to be a lighthearted, funny adventure that never dwells too much in one place. So that's a more comedic focused story without all that many attempts at deep messages or themes. So what about RPGs that are renowned for their complex themes and storytelling like Terranigma? Well, the fact of the matter is that many of these adaptations are not given the length really needed to immerse you in the world and the thematic messages as well as the game does. And I mean, we can see that here. This story is told in less than 10 chapters when the game takes around 15 hours to beat. But what's especially hard to replicate is the same sense of immersion you get from games, considering that games have the advantage of everything actually happening to you, so you're not just being an observer. And Terranigma is a really good example of this because you can feel it when reading the manga. Some of the best emotional moments of the game really hit hard specifically because you caused them and you feel that you did something bad and you feel responsible. A manga can't really evoke this same feeling, but this adaptation does try to make up for this with its strength in other areas. The most obvious is the really great artwork, which shines most in the adaptation of the trippy interlude scenes of the game. They really did a good job of elevating the already great looking pixel art with incredible detail and style. I also really love that they went to the detail to portray the world map in the weird curvy Mode 7 style that it looks like in the original game. Oh, and also I have to mention that the lion from the game is stupidly cute in this manga. So yeah, the artwork's great, and it really expresses emotions and themes, sometimes in a better way than the pixel art can. But like I said before, there's something kind of missing when you're not as immersed in the story as you are when you're actually playing it. Now, even though you don't get as immersed in this manga as you would the original game, it still hits most of the story beats of the original, albeit at a lightning quick pace, but it definitely makes for a fun way to experience Terranigma's story again. So yeah, these manga can be a great way to revisit a story in a new condensed version. This is actually especially helpful for tactical RPGs, which have much longer battles and gameplay time in general, so it's even less likely that you'll replay one even if it does have a great story like Tactics Ogre does.
I'm an ogre! You know, grab your torch and pitchforks!
Okay, sorry, I just had to make that joke, but for real, the Tactics Ogre and Ogre Battle series of games are really great and always have interesting stories. The main problems for me with their stories, though, was that often the cutscenes lacked movement and stylistic flair. To be honest, they're mostly just really simple pixel art characters standing around and talking almost every time. So needless to say, there's a lot of potential to take the good dialogue in those rather static scenes and turn them into something more compelling and dynamic in a manga form. I think they really succeeded here because the emotions of these scenes comes through so much better with this fresh coat of paint. There's lots of moments exploring characters' feelings and internal conflicts between all the action that tells a mature story about war that takes the impact war has on society and individuals seriously. As good as this manga is, you definitely have to have played the game to some degree to follow this one at the beginning of the story, but if you can look past a confusing beginning, the manga can be followed by a newcomer once it starts to pick up steam in the second chapter. However, even if you're a little lost, the strong personalities of the characters will keep you engaged and the surprisingly brutal action will have you on the edge of your seat. All of this is rendered with incredible artwork that holds its own next to the stellar art from the games. Tactics Ogre has some of my favorite concept art ever, and while this manga doesn't quite hit those same peaks, its unique style is awesome in its own right and has an incredible amount of detail and stylistic flair sometimes. Now, because a big part of the game's story was the branching paths based on player decisions, it was kind of interesting to see which path of the game the manga author chose as canon for the manga. It's just another one of those little things that really makes reading these adaptations interesting. Alright, so the ones I covered are some of my favorite JRPG manga, but honestly I could go on forever about this subject because there's so many out there. Like the Breath of Fire series has a lot of good ones, and the Tales of games have so many that you could do a full video on them alone. And then there's also the topic of 4-koma manga adaptations, which is a style of manga that are collections of 4-panel gags. This kind of thing makes a lot of sense for JRPGs like Grandia, which have lighthearted tones and characters suited for short gags. However, I found it kind of funny that Xenogears of all games received this treatment. I mean, that game has funny moments, but it's a pretty serious story, so it's funny to see how these characters are interpreted in an entirely comedic style. But hey, that's just another fun part of why I like to see these games being adapted into manga. You can sometimes see the tones drastically change. It's also always fun to see the tonal shift in the visuals, and it really never gets old to see how these JRPGs, most of which were done originally in pixel art, get translated to the very different medium of manga. One thing I found that's lost in adaptation after reading a lot of these is that many of them would probably be kinda hard to follow for people who hadn't played the games. I think that comes down to these stories being condensed and not having enough time to introduce people to the events and the details like how you would in the games. However, I guess that's not really the audience that these are made for, and they're mostly made to appeal to people who are already fans. It makes sense because I think this kind of thing really makes for great collector's items for fans of the games, and I hope we continue to see plenty more manga adaptations of JRPGs in the future. But anyways, that's all I got to say on the subject for now, but tell me some of your favorite JRPG to manga adaptations in the comments. There are so many other manga based on different genres of games too though, so who knows, I may even do a video covering manga based on fighting games in the future, so subscribe if you want to see that. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.